Welcome, everyone, and thanks for taking the hit of being in the last talk session and coming to it at ICM. Super happy to see you. And today we'll talk about negotiators' personality and their group memberships, gender and minority group, and how these affect negotiators' expectations and their outcomes. And we'll talk about how context and training can change this sometimes harmful process. So as I mentioned, we have 6 talks today, and thanks everyone, in which you'll hear about personality effects in both individual negotiator and negotiation dyad levels, talk about biases in negotiators' expectations, which affect their disclosure, how negotiation training can improve at-risk students' sense of agency in counter-stereotypical careers, how cues that reduce ambiguity in negotiation reduce gender differences, and we'll talk about the economic value of negotiators' relationships and the emergence and benefits of cliques in multi-party negotiations. So if you survive all of these talks, we hope that this session kind of makes you think more broadly about negotiations in terms of their context and the individual level factors. So who negotiates and when? Well, let us just tell you. And again, we'll have 6 talks, so short on time. We'll love to have your questions in the chat. And then hopefully we'll have time at the end to actually talk a bit more. So with that, I'll put the talk order in the chat. So Hillary, let's.
All right. Well, in advance, Peter and I decided that we need to channel our inner New Yorkers to speak quickly enough to get through all of this in the shortened amount of time. So let me tell you, this talk is about what consistency, presence, and reciprocity in negotiator behavior across partners. And I will unpack that in the next few slides. Let me first just say a big shout out to my awesome co-authors. So Jared, who's here right now, as well as Noah Eisencraft. So I want to start out with a long-standing mystery. So there's intuition that some negotiators are simply better at it than others, right? Some people are more successful, seem more adept, more comfortable. And when teaching negotiations, I don't know if others have this experience, but I often get students asking, oh, aren't great negotiators just born that way? And in spite of these intuitions, decades of empirical research have clashed with this common wisdom. Jared and I, along with co-authors, have a stream of research suggesting that this death knell is premature, and this paper is part of that larger stream. So I want to talk about deconstructing the idea of personality effects in negotiation by going back to psychologists theorizing about personality itself. So Michelle and Shoda have the most widely understood definition of personality that integrates the person-situation debate. And their definition is that personality is consistency over time in an individual's behavior when placed in the same situation. So at its core, this isn't about this trait and that trait. It's about, are you consistent? When you do the same thing over and over again, are you consistent in your behavior? And that is different from the way personality has ever been approached in the negotiation setting. And what we want to do is to take that theoretical definition into the negotiation realm and study personality at its most abstract fundamental level. And so in doing that, what we are doing is following that definition. We are examining consistency in negotiations across a series of interactions. So we're going to have people do multiple interactions, and we're going to look at 2 kinds of consistency. The first is consistency in their own behavior. So if you ask questions in one negotiation, do you tend to be consistent and ask questions in all of your negotiations you take part in? The other form of consistency we're going to look at is something we call presence, which is consistency in the behavior that you elicit from other people. So are there some people who tend to get more questions asked of them, regardless of the question asking that they do? And the theoretical foundation for this is that personality is not just about your own behavior, but it's about what you elicit, the behavior you elicit from other people. A secondary goal, based on the way the data are collected, a secondary goal we're able to address is reciprocity. So to what extent is my behavior reciprocated by others? And this is interesting in the context of behavioral spirals. So do we tend to converge in the types of acts we undertake in negotiations? So this is really about convergence. You could almost say also behavioral contagion. All right, so how are we going to do this, or how did we do this? We like a really simple design, and this is not one of them. This is the round robin design from David Kenny's social relations model. And this is something like a square dance where everyone takes turns interacting with everyone else. But if you are not old enough to remember square dancing or not from the US, this is like a sports conference. So every party takes turns negotiating with every party in a 4-person group. By the time they're done, they've had 3 different interactions. The social relations model is a statistical model that allows us to unpack data like these. It examines the influence of individual differences on any inherently interpersonal interaction. So for example, it can look at the relationship of personality to friendship behavior when you interact with multiple friends. It can look at, for example, the effect of how big a shark is in predicting how close other sharks swim towards it, right? How much personal space does a shark get based on its individual differences? All of these kinds of questions can be asked with the social relations model. The idea is that if you have multiple interactions, you can actually attribute the results to one party or the other. So if I'm negotiating with someone and I do horribly, we don't know if I'm just a bad negotiator or if that person is just so good that everyone does poorly when they work with them. Well, if you have multiple interactions, you can parse this out. And so what you parse it out is into 4 different components. The first is negotiator effects. This is what Kenny calls actor effects and what we're also calling consistency. This is what negotiators tend to do. How consistent are they? How much of the variance is explained and their behavior is explained by consistency from one interaction to the next? The second is counterpart effects, or what Kenny calls partner effects, and we're calling presence, which is the amount of variance predicted by what negotiators tend to elicit from others. In addition, there's diet effects. I wish we had a ton more time to talk about this because Jared and I and colleagues have a fun paper recently about the effect of being better with certain parties than with others. And then the last, to round out the 100%, is measurement error. So what we did was relatively standard design in the rest of the sense, in that there were students in a negotiations course. They were taking part in these 4-person round robins. So we had 25 round robins of 4 people. They took part in a mixed motive bargaining exercise. And there were 3 different exercises on the surface, 3 different topics, but in fact, they all had the same underlying structure. They all had the same point system. And in particular, there were 2 distributive issues, 1 compatible and 2 integrative issues. And these negotiations were all recorded and transcribed, and we had outcome variables, both objective points and subjective value as well. When we think about personality as behavior consistency, we wanted to think about what kinds of behaviors should we be testing. And we made the decision, rather than focusing on specific behaviors, that we wanted to collect the broadest range of behaviors possible that we thought were even potentially related to negotiating. And the first was negotiation-specific behaviors. So these are other people's coding systems that we adopted. We took the superset of all of the coding systems we could find in the past used for negotiation. So Adair and Brett and Weingart et al. And these are coding systems that really are about how the interaction partners move the process forward. And so communication behaviors, procedural behaviors, competitive behaviors, and I'm going to list them in the next slide, so I won't go too far into describing each of these behaviors. The next thing we did was we looked at the psychological model of word count, and word count has been validated as a proxy for deeper psychological content analysis. So there are factors in the word count system in Jamie Pennebaker's, what he calls Loop, this word count system. There are factors that are related to negotiations. things like confrontation words, or even word count as a measure of dominating conversation. But there are also general psychological factors that have nothing overtly to do with negotiations. Things like verb tense and pronoun usage. And we are looking at really this broad range to try to understand where people are consistent and not. The final piece of these behavioral measures was that we had these videotapes coded for interpersonal nonverbal behavior, in particular, the apparent rapport between the parties and to what extent their behavior was synchronized, their physical behavior was synchronized. And again, the idea here, this wasn't a fishing expedition, but rather we wanted to have the broadest range of behaviors possible so that we could see where there were trends and where we didn't see the effects in addition. Okay, so first hypothesis was about behavioral consistency. And it was enormous. It was enormous. These numbers are the equivalent of R-squared. They show how much of the variance in behavior was accounted for by being similar from one negotiation to the next. And what you see is for all of the factors that we examined, so this is the full list, you see stars everywhere. Almost all of them were significantly consistent. So things like asking questions. If you ask a lot of questions in one interaction, you're probably asking a lot of questions in the others. Things like making offers. If you tend to be consistent, if you make a lot of offers versus few offers, that tends to be consistent from one interaction to the next.
Hillary, we've got 3 minutes left.
Okay, language usage likewise. Then we had we had less evidence for behavioral presence. So we had a number of significant effects where you elicit consistent behavior from others. And then finally, there was evidence for dyadic reciprocity. So there were the more that one party did enacted these behaviors, the more their counterpart followed suit and converged. And I won't go through these in detail, but I'll just point out that you see a lot more reciprocity in negotiation behaviors that are what I would call standard behaviors, so communication and procedural behaviors, but you see less in the competitive behaviors. Okay, so what does this mean for us in terms of consistency? Most anything you do in a negotiation, you tend to do it a lot. And this is a challenge in the sense that you've got to watch out for your default tendencies because you need to adapt. Not every partner is the same, so you shouldn't be doing the same thing with each. Presence, you often elicit consistent behaviors from others. It's not as big an effect. And then dyadic reciprocity, there's a lot of convergence in what behaviors you enact and your partner. And this was, again, particularly strong for the standard negotiation behaviors of procedures and communication, and less so for competitive behaviors. All right, last implications coming full circle. So I started this talk by discussing the longstanding question of personality in negotiation. And I want to come back to that question because, again, the theoretical definition, personality is consistency over time in an individual's behaviors when placed in the same situation. And we've documented that here in this study, that consistency is strong, which means the role of personality in negotiation is strong too. The force is strong with this, right? And this is at the level of theory, not at the level of picking out specific traits and this trait works and this trait doesn't. It's about the idea that behavior itself is consistent. And now we can step back and say, okay, we validated the notion that personality matters deeply in negotiation. Now which traits? And this paper is part of a package where the next step is that we looked at not only the behaviors that were consistent, but how they predicted the outcomes, and then trying to backtrack out of that. What are some of the traits that tend to be associated with these consistently successful behaviors? Thank you so much. I appreciate you listening.
Hillary, that was great. Thank you very much for that. I love the work that you're doing with Jared and Noah on personality. I think that's holds some really important insights. I hope everybody can see my screen, and I'm going to go off to the races here. So thank you everybody for coming and being with us. in the final stretch of the conference. And I'm really excited to be with this fantastic group, and I'm going to try to go at New York talking speeds like Hillary suggested so that we can get through this and have some time for some discussion. Afterwards, I'll do my best to keep my eye on chat as we're going here as well. But I want to start with kind of a basic question about kind of negotiation or any sort of strategic interaction where, you know, one side knows something that the other side doesn't, which is, you know, what should I reveal? What should I hold back? Do I put some of my cards on the table? Do I kind of bring this out into the open with my counterpart in a negotiation? That might mean, you know, revealing my priority or my alternative or my limit. And I imagine anybody who's taught a negotiations course knows that students really grapple with this question. It's sort of top of mind for many students as they go through the arc of a negotiation course. And I think it's also a really fascinating question for us as social scientists, right? It intersects with some really big questions about reciprocity and cooperation and trust. This question, which is kind of the key central question for my comments today, is what happens when negotiators put information out there, especially information about their priorities? That's what I'm really going to be focused on. What happens when negotiators put their cards on the table about their priorities, or at least about an issue that is a high priority? And my own entry point for this, like the thing that gets me really interested, is sort of the folk version of this. What do people think when is going to happen when they put their priorities out on the table? How do they think their counterpart is going to react? What do they think their counterpart is going to do? And so, you know, my thinking is shaped by a tradition of work on expectancies, on these sort of mini everyday forecasts that we make about how other people are going to react to us. And I think that those forecasts we make, the expectancies we have, shape our behavior. Now, it turns out people's answers to this question vary, and that fits with the theme of this program, this session this afternoon, that we're kind of looking at individual differences. And I'm looking less at individual differences in personality per se, and more at kind of individual differences in people's answers to this question. So some people think, this is some pilot work we've done, asking them this question: what happens when you put your priorities out there in a negotiation? And some people think it's a terrible idea. You're making yourself, quote unquote, wide open to being taken advantage of. If you do this, the other side is going to walk all over you. And so some people absolutely subscribe to that. And as you might imagine, some people come down in the opposite direction. Some people say, no, it's a smart move, right? It stimulates the other party to provide their priorities. So the first party that does this, that puts this card on the table about their priorities, will fare well. So there are individual differences in people's beliefs. I'm interested in the preponderance, like the balance of this, but there's variance too. And I think we can harness that variance and think about that variance as social scientists, how people answer this question for themselves. So that's kind of like the folk answer. So like some people think it's going to work out well if you reveal your priorities. Some people think it's a terrible idea and it's going to haunt you. You're going to regret it. Now, I'm also interested in us as researchers, right? So what do researchers think happens when you, early on in a negotiation, are very forward with your counterpart about putting a card on the table about this is what matters most to me? And now it turns out we vary too, as a scholarly community, in our answers to this. And there's some really fascinating work on this. I don't have time today to summarize all this, but some people think, look, there are dividends. Some people saying on balance, this increases joint gains. There's some evidence of this, and it can provoke reciprocal information sharing. But there's other really compelling work that suggests the opposite, that there are some disadvantages to this, that it doesn't help or it even hurts you. So some recent research suggests a first mover disadvantage when you put a full package out on the table early on and signal your priorities accordingly, that you elicit fake counter offers, feigned priorities from your counterpart. So I think we need some evidence, right? That, you know, folk beliefs vary and scientific beliefs don't quite converge on what the answer is here. So I think we need some evidence, and that's what I'm trying to walk you through very briefly today. Some evidence on what do people think about this and what actually happens. And we see if we can compare those two things and see, are people on the mark, or do people tend to skew one direction or another from reality? And I'll just tell you really quickly, I've got three intuitions that kind of guide me in my thinking about this research. One is just this idea that expectancies guide our behavior. So here we have the lemmings, and that is what the lemmings believe is going to happen, right? Even when our expectancies are wildly wrong, they still guide us in what we do, right? We think we're going to rise up to the clouds and we fire ourselves off the cliff and something different happens, but it's that forecast that we're going to go upwards that leads us to take that leap. So our expectancies shape our behavior. And I'm not going to bore you today with some of the pilot work I've collected that just shows that this connection is really strong. People who think revealing priorities is going to lead to good things, do it. People who think revealing priorities is going to lead to a disaster, don't do it. So that's one intuition, but let me call it two other quick intuitions. One is, I think based on, a couple decades of teaching people about negotiations, that there are often benefits to this. And my guess is many of you talk about when and why and how this might be beneficial. So I think the actual outcomes of this tends to be skew in the direction of benefits, but that people, especially people who haven't had any special training in negotiations, tend to be much more pessimistic, that their expectancies probably skew towards this not being a good idea. And I'm saying this in part because I feel like this is a journey that I see my students take over my courses, and I suspect over many of your courses as well, is that they revise their expectancies based on their experiences. But let me talk about the studies. I want to tell you today about two sets of studies where I've got some measure of predictions, expectancies, and some measure of outcomes where we can compare those things. One is on real world negotiations, not in the classroom, not hypotheticals, people's recall of real world meaningful negotiations. And I have one sample that makes a prediction about what's going to happen and one sample of people reporting on what actually happened in their real world negotiations. And then I'll tell you briefly about a second pair of studies where we put people experimentally into a negotiation and controlled this and manipulated. We told some people to disclose their priorities, and we told other people nothing. We just put them in a control condition, and we can compare what happened. And we have another sample that predicted what happened. And so we can compare those things. So let me briefly walk you through these studies, and I'm kind of skipping a bunch of the details of the methods of this to try to get to the results. I'll start with the kind of the reality, and then I'll back up and tell you about the parallel expectation study. Here we have about almost 100 MBA students who are current MBA students who'd had a negotiation course, and so we're able to we could communicate with them about multi-issue negotiations. We asked them to think about their own, outside of the classroom, most recent meaningful multi-issue negotiation. Now, we did this with a separate sample of US adults who were not MBA students, who hadn't had negotiation training. We got almost the exact same results, but I'm going to focus on the MBA report sample here. We asked them in this real negotiation, did you reveal your priorities a lot? And it turns out people vary, but 60-ish% of people said yes. I was very forward with my counterpart about my priorities. We asked them other questions like, did it help? Did you get what you want? Are you satisfied with the outcome? And we asked them some questions about how their counterpart reacted when they disclosed their priorities. In parallel, separate sample, a couple hundred US adults basically tried to predict the results of this study. We said we talked to a sample of people. They told us about real world negotiations. Let's think about the people who told us they revealed a lot of information to their counterpart about their priorities. What do you think happened? Make a prediction. Did those people say it helped? Did they get what they wanted? Were they satisfied with the deal? And how did their counterpart react to that disclosure of priorities? So a few results now when we look at what people said. Oh, and I should say this, by the way, so for me as a teacher, this was actually fascinating. So we captured data on this. We just want to know, how often do people perceive in real world negotiations that there are differences in priorities between themselves and their counterpart? And it turns out a lot of the time, right? So many of us talk about potential for integration in negotiations. And here it's almost 90% of people reporting on meaningful real world multi-issue negotiations say, I felt that there was at least some difference between my priorities and my counterpart's priorities. So that is, a normal thing. And so now you could do horse trading, you can do potential integration. So, okay, what did we find? In terms of predictions, we saw people saying, it's kind of a coin toss on whether revealing priorities is going to help. 50% of people are going to, or on average, people are going to say they got 50% of what they wanted when they revealed their priorities a lot. And the share of them who will say they were satisfied with their negotiation, maybe only half of them will be satisfied. So let's compare this with the reality of what people said about the real world negotiations. You can see it's markedly different, right? Almost 90% of people said in retrospect that sharing their priorities with their counterpart helped them in their real world negotiation. They made this choice, they look back, they have no regrets, they feel like it helps them. We also asked questions about how did your counterpart react? And we asked the prediction sample, how do you think they would react? The real world predictions were kind of mixed. They thought, well, at least a good share of the time, the counterpart will react by trying to hold the rest of the deal hostage or pretend like, oh, you care most about that, so do I, right? Versus some more kind of collaborative responses. They'd reveal their own priorities in return or try to craft a deal that would actually respect the person's, the discloser's priorities. So these predictions were a little mixed, but I wouldn't say they were enthusiastic, wildly enthusiastic about the benefits of revealing priorities. When we look at what people actually reported, again, we see a big number of people, 80%, 90% of people saying their counterpart responded to this in a constructive, collaborative way by revealing information in return. Very few people said my counterpart tried to hold the deal hostage or tried to fake me out. Now, of course, if they had a counterpart who was good at faking them out, they would never know that their counterpart was trying to fake them out. So we have to assume that's going on in there. But still, there's a difference between the predictions we're seeing and the reality we're seeing. Now, let me keep going here. And I'm trying to keep, okay, 2 minutes left. All right, I'm going to keep racing through this. The scenario study predictions. What I can tell you is, so we had people go through a study where they were assigned to divide up the contents with a counterpart of a storage container. Basically, they were an antique dealer, their counterpart was an antique dealer. They had a set of priorities across these issues. There were 3 records, 2 lamps, 2 paintings, 1 rug, and people in the person A role were told they really cared most about the lamps. Their counterparts, they didn't know this, but their counterparts in the person B role cared most about the record sets. The question was, what happens when you tell your counterpart about the lamps? And so we assigned some people to reveal information about that they really cared about the lamps. And so we have people in a control condition and people in this condition where they were told, first thing you say to your counterpart is, I want those lamps. And what we see, and we had another sample that tried to predict the outcomes of this. And in brief, what we see is these predictions were not seeing much benefit to disclosure. So people making a prediction about what would happen didn't think disclosure was going to pay off. But when we actually measured based on the chat, so we recorded these chat negotiations, we see that there were great benefits from disclosure. The people who disclosed ended up getting more of what mattered most to them and not really regretting having done that. Now, I guess I'll just say this as my way of wrapping up. So we see these 2 pairs of studies. Disclosure expectancies, I think, shape behavior, even when they're wrong. And our evidence suggests people are pessimistic about this. I think there's evidence as well to think that that's malleable. One thing we find that when we try to explain people's expectancies is people who've had more training, people who've had a negotiation course, tend to be more optimistic in their expectancies. And so that's a way of, I guess, us congratulating ourselves that we're doing something right. I think these beliefs people have make a big effect in their behavior, but what we're doing is helping people refine and tune these beliefs. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
That was fascinating, and I love how it builds on the earlier. Can we get people to do that consistently across situations with integrative potential? I'm going to talk more about group inclusion than group differences. I'm going to talk about research on, can people, none, they can't, you guys cannot yet see my slides. Do you see them now? Okay, great. I'm going to try to spread you guys out so I can see more of you. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about negotiation as a potential tool for persistence in counter-stereotypical fields, and in particular focusing on historically marginalized students in tech and engineering. So I'll just start with this quote, but it captures well, actually, a lot of behavioral science around these questions. It's a quote from Rana El Kalioubi, who's an Egyptian computer scientist and entrepreneur. She says, you don't have to be a genius to be a scientist, but you do need to be persistent. And one of the biggest challenges we're facing with advancing historically marginalized students in STEM and people in STEM industries is the leaky pipeline. And actually, we don't even, it's not only a matter of maybe differential entry, we actually have higher rates of loss of these students and other folks from people in industry from historically marginalized groups. There is growing encouraging evidence from behavioral science that creating access to developmental relationships and opportunities can actually stem the tide of this loss of students. And what's really interesting actually about that research is it's not about, it's the comparison case is a high departure rate of students. And what you're trying to do is just reduce the departure rate of these students from fields like tech and engineering, what we're going to focus on. Okay, so why negotiation? You know, there's so much discussion right now about fix the system, not the person. You know, is this targeting the wrong thing here? I'm going to make an argument, a practical set of arguments, and I'm going to argue normative set of arguments for why it's good to focus on negotiation. One, from a practical perspective, I get a little frustrated with this kind of progressive elite notion that we know how to fix the system in order to be inclusive of people from these groups. And I think from a practical perspective, it would be wise for us to be inviting folks who've been historically marginalized to the table to help us see what is useful. And if you look at recent studies, organizational studies, some work that I've done with Julia Baer, who's here, and Bobby Thomason, where we studied looking into the role of negotiation in women's career paths and organizations, we found that women actually use negotiation as a tool to overcome traditionally gendered barriers to advancement. So things like, oh, well, everybody who's ever had this job is an engineer, you know, men are more likely to be the engineers than women. We have wonderful examples of how women basically negotiate their ways into jobs for which they are not traditionally qualified, when the traditional qualifications were masculine stereotypic, and then thrive. Another classic example is the negotiation of work-family conflict, particularly where women are rising up to levels where they haven't been before in these highly demanding jobs. They're negotiating more inclusive systems for parents, for working parents, from which men are benefiting as well as women. So that's my practical argument. The other argument is that, you know, there's just growing evidence in organizational research, but in negotiation research specifically, that a lot of this, these dynamics that we've documented for gender and negotiation likely apply more broadly to other historically marginalized groups. And so we talk a lot about gender roles, but I'm hoping theoretically also, as we think about these lack of fit questions, that this is going to urge us to probe a little bit more deeply what is status and power and what is gender specifically. So in addition to these practical reasons, I would argue this is a normative reason. And that is this, not only may we not come up with the right solutions, but there's a little bit of, you know, liberal elite patriarchy involved in the notion that we don't need to invite these people to the table to be negotiating. But part of the problem also is that negotiation training is ubiquitous within elite institutions, so law schools, business schools, professional schools, but it is not broadly available, certainly at the college level or outside of, you know, pay negotiation training for women to broader populations. And the question is, how would we think about creating more inclusive negotiation programming, right? So we want to think about, yes, best practice skills training, but we want identifiable case examples. So here's an example of a case that we developed, which was developed based on the stories and interviews that we did. It's a story of a gender ambiguous, actually there's no pronouns, young person in a first internship what are the things that this person can negotiate? And then the case discussion is around what's negotiable, how to negotiate, how to reduce ambiguity, et cetera. And I'll talk about this. There is also, though, in this more inclusive negotiation programming, we should include what is evidence showing that what are the differential barriers that historically underrepresented groups face. So like, why is ambiguity such a challenge? Not only why is that likely to breed bias in negotiation, but why are historically underrepresented groups less likely? They might be great climbers, they may be great negotiators, but they may not know, they may be differentially disadvantaged in knowing what is negotiable or how to negotiate within the environment. Another thing that we should be including is backlash and other forms of resistance. So the backlash of gender-based backlash effects are well documented, but there's growing evidence now that Asian men from emerging economies, Black men in the United States also face resistance to their attempts to self-advocate. And then finally, how do we think about developing evidence-based strategies that address potential biases as well as best practices? And this is another example of where we took a HBR article and then translated it, putting in more early career inclusive examples. So last summer, in the middle of the pandemic, there was concern that all these students, all of our students were losing internship opportunities, but particularly students from less advantaged, less privileged populations. They were getting advice like get a family member to give you a programming challenge over the summer. I mean, you have to be from a privileged family background to get that type of a job. And a lot of them were like, they were packing groceries. And so we wanted to create a professional opportunity for them. So here are 53 students from 16 colleges. We ran them through a 6-week program that includes access to professional advice. So this is, the woman on the cliff. We want to give them a better sense of what is, and expose them to more tacit knowledge from their environment, but then also give them inclusive negotiation programming. And I'm going to focus on integrative skills because, and I can talk later about it, I think that's critical to reducing backlash. So here's our quasi RCT design. In short, we had a number of students who expressed interest in the program, some who applied. We did a lottery, a balanced lottery, more or less, with those in the program. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a comparison of what worked between the beginning and the end of the program, and then what effects lasted when we got back in touch with them at the end of the following academic year. We also did some qualitative research because I personally was a little nervous. Oh my gosh, what do these guys negotiate? Is this relevant to them? But there are a lot of very compelling negotiation examples, just simply getting access to Wi-Fi, which is a classic issue actually in the development literature. Also, having to negotiate accommodations when family situations, being in resource poor environments and trying to come up with creative solutions to those types of problems. Lots of negotiation examples. We use their interviews to generate examples. This year, educational choices, the most common examples, interestingly, were with family, and that's something that we're pursuing a lot with peers around team projects, and then, of course, faculty and prospective employers. In general, it was pretty easy for them. Out of 53 students, only one said it was very hard or impossible to come up with an example. Okay, so I'm going to show you direct effects again from time 0, the start of the program, time 1, and the end of the program. We want to look at the degree to which they're embracing the professional advice of the leaders in practice, their sense of integrative self-efficacy, their propensity to negotiate, and their sense of professional identification to tech and engineering. Here. So comparing the end of August, the end of the program, to the beginning of the program, what you see, and these are just difference scores, and they're statistically significant, everything I'm showing you here. And so what you see is that their integrative self-efficacy climbed meaningfully, as did their sense of propensity to negotiate. As well, here's this drop in professional identity over this pandemic summer, right? And so we had a significant gain for our students. Now, what lasted, when we looked to the end of the academic year, we didn't manage to sustain the sense of difference in professional identity, but we did manage to sustain the sense of embracing the professional advice, a sense of self-efficacy, and this propensity to negotiate. In fact, there was continuous growth in the negotiation measures over the year, which is kind of fun. So what lasted, and we're also looking at the end of the year, we looked at opportunity seeking and then the propensity to feel like you can overcome barriers. And what we found was that being in the Leadership Academy significantly increased integrative self-efficacy as of August, as of the end of the program. And those who at the end of the program felt greater sense of integrative self-efficacy, they were more likely to report engaging in this opportunity-seeking behavior. They were also more likely to report feeling a sense of challenge facing barriers as opposed to threat, right? So I feel like I can overcome the difficulties I'm facing. I have what it takes. And this was kind of the dream. So these are encouraging preliminary results. We're continuing in terms of opportunity seeking and barriers. We're continuing the research. We have another cohort that just launched this year. And we're also continuing with the development of more inclusive teaching materials, hopefully that we can broaden this concept to other groups. How'd I do, Ina? Did I make it in time? All right, excellent.
Perfect. Before time even. I mean, if we're all so prompt, we'll even have time at the end for discussion. So let's do that. But meanwhile, let's keep the chat going too. And thanks.
Okie dokie. Can you guys see me and hear me? Okay. I have a bit of a sun issue going on here, but that's okay. Work through that. Okay, so it's actually wonderful that we're following Hannah's presentation because our work is quite related and also builds off of some of her past work. So this is a perfect order. So the title of our presentation is Not All Cues Are Created Equal: How Disambiguating Cues Can Mitigate and Exacerbate Gender Differences in Negotiation. So let me jump right into this. As we all know, there is a persistent gender pay gap, and that has really been, in many ways, the practical inspiration for work on gender differences in negotiation that have really developed extensively over the past few decades. And one of the themes that has emerged is the role of ambiguity. In other words, that gender differences are mitigated in negotiation situations that are less ambiguous. And this, of course, is not surprising. It's consistent with classic work in social psychology as well. So we know that when salary ranges are transparent, that's helpful. We know that simply when we just have explicit information, but by the way, salaries are negotiable, that eliminates gender gaps. When there's information about the behavioral norms in the situation and that negotiation is viewed as acceptable, that's also helpful. And we also know that negotiation experience as well is very helpful in mitigating gender gaps, which also makes sense. As we become more experienced at something, there's less ambiguity about how to behave in that situation. But my co-authors and I started to really dig a little bit more and think about, what is this what we like to call disambiguating information really conveying to people in a negotiation situation, right? So we can think, for example, if we have information about the salary range, that it's giving us descriptive information, right? So now we have a better idea of what is possible, what the actual, what the numbers are that we're talking about here. But it's also, when you think about it, giving some information about whether it is appropriate to negotiate, right? So it's also giving some normative information, even just by virtue of knowing that there's a salary range that may provide, a clue that, hey, wait a second, there's some, there's some wiggle room here, there's some room to work. Now, when we first started this project, we actually were very focused on negotiation training, which is why I was very intrigued by Hannah's presentation. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to present those studies, but I do just want to say that in one of the studies we ran, and in which we actually created different videos for negotiation training and tested them out, surprisingly, what we found was that the video that really focused on descriptive information about how to negotiate actually made gender differences worse. So we found this very surprising. The gender gap was actually larger in the condition with this video than when we gave participants no training information whatsoever. And really, we only closed the gender gap in propensity to negotiate when we included both descriptive and normative information in our training video. So this really led us to start thinking about the fact that, yes, there's plenty of research showing that it's great to reduce ambiguity, but does, do all informational cues necessarily reduce gender gaps, right? In other words, is this always the case? And by the way, I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but there's a really big push now for transparency, for pay transparency about salaries. It's in fact legislated in many countries in Europe now. And so I think it's interesting, and we're by no means anti-transparency, but I think what our findings suggest is that we may need to be thoughtful to a certain extent that transparency is not necessarily a panacea for gender disparities, but I'll come back to that at the end. So we started to think about, why could some of these informational cues potentially operate differently for men and women? Why would they potentially respond to them differently? Why did we actually exacerbate gender gaps in our training video? And so obviously we know that women may have greater backlash concerns than men. That could influence how they're, interpreting, using these informational cues. Deservingness, we know that there are gender differences in deservingness. In terms of men's sense of deservingness tends to be inflated compared to women's. And finally, we also know that that men often feel a pressure to prove their masculinity, and negotiation is one context in which they can do so. And so they may be particularly motivated depending on the informational cues to do that. Let me give you an applied, really just sort of an applied example of what we had in mind, and then I'll jump in. I'm just going to present two of our studies today. So this is actually a screenshot from when I did a search on salary.com for a project accounting manager position in New York, New York. Lo and behold, salary is actually pretty good if you ask me, but in any case, what I want to draw your attention to is there's a lot of information here, right? Job seekers today really have extensive information. And so, we look at this and think, well, what number am I going to focus on, right? So we could, if we think about extant research on gender differences in negotiation, it kind of makes sense to think women may be focusing, maybe I'll focus at the median, right? I don't have to worry about backlash that way. I don't necessarily feel like I deserve anything higher than that, so I'm good at the median. In contrast, men may, zero in on the 75th percentile, right? They're less concerned about backlash. This may be a situation for them really to behave assertively, prove their manhood, and they may feel entitled to it, right? So all that is to say is we've given people a bunch of information, doesn't necessarily mean we've eliminated a gender gap, right? We may still see a gender gap even with all this information. So essentially, this is what we've been looking at in a series of studies, as to what extent do these, what we call disambiguating cues, mitigate versus exacerbate gender differences in salary negotiation outcomes. And particularly, what is the role of perceptions of appropriateness? In other words, do we need information, not just descriptive information, but information about appropriateness? Okay, I'm going to show you two studies. One is a scenario and one is a behavioral negotiation. So in this study, we created job offer scenario, and we were interested in the salaries that our participants would request. And this was an online study. And so essentially we had four conditions. First of all, we had a baseline just with a range, and this was a nice replication of Hannah's previous work. Then we said, okay, we're going to give them the range, and we're going to tell them that within that range, the average salary is low, 75K within this range of 65 to 100. Then we had what we called the high average salary queue. So same thing, range, but we're going to tell them that the average salary is pretty high. And then we had what we called a high value queue, where we gave them the range and we said, by the way, you're considered really valuable. Okay, so let me show you what we found. Okay, so lo and behold, we replicated Hannah's findings that when we just gave them the range, no gender gap. In fact, both men and women came nicely right down the middle in their salary request in this condition. But interestingly enough, when we told them, by the way, the average salary is 75K, interestingly enough, we have a big gender gap. Men seem to have completely ignored that information. Women seem to have attended to it much more so. And lo and behold, despite the fact that they have more information than with just the range, we actually see a significant gender gap. In the high average salary, clearly both men and women benefited from that. And we don't see a gender gap here, although spoiler alert, that switches a bit in our next study. And finally, in this high value Q plus range, again, men just ran with that information. They really asked for a lot of money there. Women did not. So again, what we see is that despite giving additional information above and beyond the range, we see a very significant gender gap. So to be a little more forest and less trees here, I guess what we're finding is that ambiguity reduction does not necessarily remove gender differences, so to speak. Okay. Next study I want to share with you in my last couple minutes was a salary negotiation. It was interactive, though interactive over Zoom because we collected the data this past semester. And so we decided we really wanted to focus on this high versus low average salary effect that we found. And so I'm really going to spare the details here, but suffice it is to say that the job candidate, the participant playing the role of the job candidate got a range, and again, got the low versus high average salary within the range. The participant who played the recruiter was simply told that they were authorized to give a salary within that range, but was not given that information about high versus low average salary. And again, they did conduct the negotiation. It was face-to-face, it was interactive, but again, it was on Zoom. Okay, so we had a variety of measures about salary. And then we also asked them about their perceptions of appropriateness of asking for a high salary. All right, so lo and behold, what did we find? So in this case, the results are slightly different than our online study. So we don't see that gender gap we saw previously with the low average salary. The men in this sample seem to have gone by the rules, so to speak. They didn't ignore that information, maybe because it was students, maybe because they're less experienced. In the high average salary, though, we again see a gender difference, mainly because men are coming in slightly above the information. Women, interestingly enough, did not actually hit that high average salary Q. They actually came in below it. This is for their initial salary request. And it was the same pattern as well for the aspiration value. In terms of the final amount agreed upon, we again see no gender difference with the low average salary information, but we do see a gender difference in the high average salary information condition. And I should say that this study was pre-registered on OSF, but given our sample size, we pre-registered contrast analyses. So those are the statistics I'm showing you now. And I should also mention that this gender difference in the high average salary Q was indeed mediated by appropriateness. And so what we found was that men indeed rated asking for a high salary is more appropriate when they got that high salary Q than women, no difference in that low average salary Q condition. Okay, so to sum up, I know I'm probably out of time. Again, reducing ambiguity is helpful, but not a panacea. Clearly, both men and women did benefit from having that high salary information, but it did not eliminate gender gaps. So there's a lot of, again, calls for pay transparency. Obviously, we're in no way opposed to pay transparency, but I do think that clearly transparency is beneficial, but it's not foolproof. It's not going to completely solve this problem. I think we need to think about the information that's being given, to what extent it signals appropriateness and accounts for people's concerns about appropriateness. So I will leave you with another screenshot. This is payscale.com. I even got a little bot here asking me, hi there, how are you looking for salary data, which I found, very thoughtful of them, since I'm always looking for salary data. So thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm still a Navhart, and I'm very happy to see everyone and present you work with Maurice, who's also on the call, in which we'll talk about the economic importance of negotiators' relationships. So I'm trying to tie up some of the things we talked about, or other people talked about, right? We negotiate in many, many contexts. And what I'll argue is that all these contexts are not the same. So, for example, if you think about negotiating to buy this lovely blue sofa, you're concerned about the price and the condition of the sofa. You're probably less concerned about what the seller thinks of you and whether there are or may be backlash concerns, right? Now, if you then think about negotiating with people to come move aforementioned sofa, Now you may be differently concerned about the price and your relationship with these movers and whether they pivot or don't pivot. Similarly, you can think of someone to come clean your house or any other form or most other forms of employment. In these contexts, we care about the price and the deal terms, but also about what will happen after we reach an agreement and how motivated these people will be to actually implement the deal or to go above and beyond, which I'll argue will depend on the relationships we form with these people, with our negotiation counterparts. And so in such context, our relationships that we form or don't form through the negotiation process can actually have value, economic value. Now, if you want another example, think about negotiating for someone to draw you a horse. Okay, you reach an agreement, but this person now is really upset with you. Here's what might happen, right? Now, this deal is not fantastic, and the deal terms you negotiated may not actually represent the entire economic value of that agreement or of that negotiation. Okay, so classic work, including by many folks in this room, argues that we have different motives when we think about and engage in the negotiation process. So of course we care about our material outcomes, and we may also care about our relational outcomes. And classic work, again, proposes that these are orthogonal axes or independent concerns that we may have. And where we are on this two-dimensional grid will affect how we see the problem and the strategies that we take. But if you believe the examples I just gave, in many cases, relational outcomes may actually affect the economic value or our material outcomes. And so these seemingly orthogonal axes may actually be correlated. And this correlation or this impact of relationships on economic value, I'll argue, depends and varies with the context of the negotiation, with the topic and issues that we're negotiating. So what we propose in this paper is a factor to characterize negotiation context, which we call ARO, or the economic relevance of relational outcomes. Everyone needs an acronym. And this represents, again, how much the relationship can affect your value. So, for example, think about hiring someone to come clean your house. If they're happy with you, how will that affect your value? Potentially, you'll get better service. If, on the other hand, they're upset with you, maybe not so good, right? So we think of this difference between the benefit of a good relationship and the harm of a bad relationship as ARO. And these types of contexts are often higher ARO, while contexts such as buying a vacuum cleaner, where the relationship can't really move the value of this vacuum or sofa or what have you, are low ARO. Now, while I'm presenting here a difference between goods and services, this is not just that. And in fact, in studies, we had also high and low ARO services. And so we think of this as a continuum, but I'll use goods and services for illustration. Okay, so we think of this as a fundamental characteristic of negotiation context. And across a variety of studies, several of which I'll share today, I'll show you that high ARO increases our concern about our relationships, increases collaborative choices in the negotiation. And if you do this in high ARO context, it improves your outcomes. Now, we did this in a variety of contexts, in Craigslist, MTurk, and including interactive lab studies, and I'll share a few of these. So I'm happy to talk about the others later. So let's go to MTurk, and I'll show you how high and low ARO negotiations differ. So what we did in this study is had participants imagine that they're looking to either buy a vacuum or a sofa or another product, or they're looking to hire a housekeeper or a mover and so forth. Now, as I mentioned, another study, we had also high and low ARO services. So imagine you're in one of these conditions. Now, how much are you concerned about your relationships with your relationship with a counterpart? Well, people are much more concerned about having a good relationship with a negotiation counterpart and having them like them in high arrow context than in low arrow context. And they're less concerned about having good deal terms, achieving good deal terms in a negotiation in high arrow context than in low arrow context. Now, of course, people are concerned about the deal terms, but less so in high arrow context. Okay, now how do they behave? To look at this, we adapted or created a new negotiation paradigm, adapting it from economics, in which people had to choose a negotiation strategy. My animations fell short here, but we had people choose a negotiation bot among a set of 5. So it ranges from a very aggressive competitive bot here that will give you high profit, decent deal, and the other person will absolutely hate you, will never want to deal with you again. And the bots got progressively more friendly all the way to this one, which gives you very low profit, awful deal terms, but the other person will really like you. Now, these numbers were chosen to be, again, on this diagonal, to force people to make the trade-off between favorable deal terms and favorable relationships. And we looked at this choice where people are on this line in high arrow context and in low arrow context. And what we see is that people chose, or resolve this trade-off more in favor of relationships in high arrow context in red than in low arrow context in blue. The lighter dots are the standard errors. So a significant difference. And then we asked them to make a second choice between a bigger and better set of bots, negotiation strategies, all the way from very competitive to very friendly. And they again made this trade-off more in favor of relationships in high arrow than in low arrow. Now, why do we have them make 2 choices? Because then we could also see the slopes, or what happens when we extend the budget. What do they do with every additional point we give them? Okay, so for every additional point in the low arrow context, they allocated about 1/3 of a point to the relationships and 2/3 to 1/3 to relationships and 2/3 to deal terms. This in contrast with 55% for relationships in high arrow context. Okay, so great, but why would people do this? Why does it matter? How? Now, for this, we had an interactive incentivized lab study in which we had boss and worker participants chat online, and this affected both this chat and the second stage, which we'll see in a second, affected the boss's earnings from this study. In the low arrow context, the boss earned, depending on what they agreed on, and a random luck number, okay? In the high arrow context, the boss's payment depends on the negotiation as well as on the worker's subsequent post-negotiation work on moving task, okay? Now, what we see, similar to the boss I showed you, is that conversations were a lot friendlier in the high arrow context than in the low arrow context. They're rated as less conflictual and more relationship focused. And how did this affect the earnings and the workers' effort? Well, in the low arrow context, workers still had to do the task. It just didn't affect the boss's earnings. And irrespective of whether they were annoyed with the boss or happy with the boss, they did about the same. So the boss earned the same amount of points, irrespective of their relationship. So better off to focus on the deal terms, right? But this is not the case in high arrow context, in which bosses, yes, they gave up deal terms initially, but they earned a lot more, or could earn a lot less if they upset the worker in high arrow context, okay? So taken together, what I've hoped to convince you, or at least make you think about, is that we should characterize negotiation context along this continuum of how important the relationships are to the economic value of the negotiation as a whole. And this, again, is a fundamental aspect that we rarely think about, teach, or research. And this is sad and unfortunate, and hopefully will change, because it affects negotiators' concerns as they enter the negotiation, as they plan for it. It affects the negotiation behavior in the negotiation and after the negotiation in a way that substantially alters the negotiation, the overall economic outcome. And again, this is especially important and relevant in service exchanges, which constitute approximately 80% of the GDP in the US and other industrialized countries. And these exchanges, which are often high aero, are rarely studied. And so I'll leave you with that and with my contact details, so you may ask me questions and give me comments. Thanks very much.
Hey everybody, how you doing? Great to see you. Let me get a share going here. Let's see, that should do it, I believe. There you go. So hopefully you can see that. And let me do this, and I also will do that. And let me move this out of the way. And this also, there you go. All right, so I'm going to talk extremely fast. Those of you may know me as a New Yorker, and though I'm in LA right now, and so, but I'm very happy that you're here and to hear the presentation and these other wonderful presentations, actually. And so my project here that I want to talk about is with my colleague Marlon Twyman, who's a professor at the Annenberg School for Communication. Is a networks person, is an engineer, and quite a wonderful colleague. This symposium, and thanks to Ina for putting this together, is about context and how that affects the characteristics of individual and group level in negotiation. Here, we ask the question, how do networks affect negotiation, which I think is a context variable. And the nice thing about networks area is there are a bunch of analytical tools that are very useful, including the concept of the motif. So that's what I want to talk about, what they are, where do they come from, when do they form, and then a little bit about how they might affect outcome. But the project here involved developing a paradigm, and a negotiation network or market paradigm. And here we have some property, real estate, and these are parcels. And this is a simulated real estate market. We've been doing this in Zoom. We actually, a little while ago, ran some stuff face-to-face. You have, imagine 20 buyers, 20 sellers. You've got agents. They're all agents. So no one's an owner of property here, but they're representing owners of property. The buyer agents have unlimited budget. The seller agents have unique parcels, 50 unique parcels. And they make commissions. Okay, this is what real estate agents do. Here we had 2 issues for every parcel. Price of the property or the parcel, and then the closing date. Okay, and these are 2 distinct issues. We created 50 parcel or properties, and they're unique for every seller. So this is a vast tract of land that's become available, and a lot of people are selling them. A lot of people are interested in buying them as well. There are payoffs for each one. And so take a look at these, if you can see these right here, these are the points in parentheses. This is the standard integrative bargaining task, which you've all seen over the years, sort of based on the Pruittian paradigm, which he got from Harold Kelly, who was one of his advisors in graduate school. And but Kelly got it from Siegel and Foraker, by the way. Okay, these parcel property, these values differ in terms of their value. And you can see here, there's an integrative structure. But let me just say how this works. In the market, you got 40 people here. You choose whom you want to negotiate with. You meet with that person, you can talk or in a chat, and you deal with one parcel at one time. You agree or not, and then you repeat. And so that works through the market, 30-minute market. You can imagine when this is done face-to-face in a classroom, it is hectic. It is very much a lot of fun to run this, as everyone's yelling out and trying to find buyers and sellers and sell their properties. timed market, and time is a scarce commodity. Generates a lot of data, many variables, many measures. Who negotiates with whom? And we'll see, actually, I'm going to cut to the chase here. People often will choose their friend to go to, at least first, or their team project partners that are part of a class. How many transactions does a person do? What's the value of each deal? Is there any efficiencies? For example, you can see there's trade-off potential within each parcel type. There's the integrative potential here, and that's the case for all 50 parcels. Here we're just showing, the 20. Okay, and so you could also talk about total market earnings. When that market is closed after 30 minutes, how much money is in your pocket? Okay, this is what real estate agents are especially interested in, and so you have the average per deal. And there's implications for tactics. Do you hold your high value properties for later in the market, or you try to sell them right away? Do you spend as much time as you can on any one deal, or do you just try to make as many deals as possible? Okay, and there are many market level does the market clear? Is there efficiencies at the market level? And then we can vary parameters or features of the market and have the market be the unit of analysis. So this does churn through a lot of participants in a very relatively short period of time. To the question of, should you do a lot of deals, or should you just work on getting favorable terms on any one deal? Well, the data are pretty clear. This is a correlate. Here you have some variables, you have number of deals, you have the total points made, you have the average per deal, which is a reflection of how much time you spend on trying to get a favorable outcome on any one deal. And you can see that you make money in this market by doing a lot of deals. And real estate agents know this. If you've bought and sold properties, I've done that in various places in the world, and often real estate agents, they want to spend as little time as possible with you because they want to get on to the next deal. And so, this is a huge effect. Okay, this paradigm is very useful for studying negotiation motifs. So it's hard to say what a motif is or see what it is from the literature that we have already. Only a handful of market studies, at least from the OB or behavioral side or the psychological side of it. But the network area has a bunch of really nice analytical tools, and it is our belief that one should do a motif analysis of a negotiation market to look at the potentials in terms of the patterns. A motif is a recurring significant pattern of interactions within the market. And there's a concept of the clique or clique, where people pair up and there's a triad and they are making deals and they stay within their own set of individuals within the market. Here's some really nice paper, quite well known in the networks area, on motifs. You can see here a particular motif. Imagine here we have a seller, and their seller is selling to two buyers, okay, in this exchange. Here we have this motif. Here we have two-sided market, sellers, buyers. We have a seller and two buyers, or we have two sellers and buyers. This is a triad. The arrows represent property bought or sold. And the nodes are buyers and sellers. Okay, this is a motif. Now, if it's random in this market, then with 20 and 20 across the market, you'd expect the probability of a deal is 0.05. Okay, that is, any one seller can sell to one of 20 buyers on any given transaction. Okay, but look at this one. Here we have 10 transactions took place in this market, and this buyer got 9 of them, 90%. Why? And that's the question. And so a wealthy buyer buying up all the properties, or maybe the friends, we don't know. Okay, well, that's the interesting question. We find that friends do a lot of transactions. Like here you have a seller who has all their properties, and they sell them all to one buyer. Okay, when we're running this in the classroom, I was like, this happened a lot. And it's like, no, that's not, we want to get a little more action in the market. And so like good regulators, and as the instructor in the class, I can set the rules in this market. And I created a rule saying, you can't make a deal with the same person twice in a row, okay, in subsequent markets. And so, so what do? Well, they adapt. And this is one thing that happens in markets is people adapt to constraints. And we see this many, many examples in the real world. Let me show you an example of an adaptation. Here we have 4 friends and 2 in buyer roles and 2 in the seller roles. They sit next to each other, or in the Zoom, they go to each other and they alternate. You see a pattern like this. Seller 8 goes to buyer 15, seller 9 goes to buyer 15, seller 8 that goes to buyer 16, and then seller 9 goes to buyer 16, and they go back, they just circle. And that's a motif, and it's a clique in this market. And in this case here, you can see this is a record, a seller 8 record and seller 9 record. You can see that, you can see this pattern quite clearly, and they're just cycling through all the properties. These 4 people want to deal with each other, and they go through all the properties that they can do with each other, and then they look for others in the market, okay? And point is that motifs are dynamic. People adapt to constraints in the market. They are, in this case, alternating and it's coordinated, and it's largely driven by competition and the belief that they could do quite well within their clique better than others in the market. Okay, so I think it's largely driven by competition. So what do we have here? We have this symposium is about context, and we've seen these really great presentations. We see clear indicators of that. We asked the question here: do features of networks affect negotiation? And yes, I think with formation of cliques. We developed this paradigm, which I put in parentheses here. That's nice. It is nice. It's actually great to run as a class exercise, and it also is a very useful tool for collecting market level data in negotiation, which I believe we need more of. We think or believe that these sort of suggest that the network motif is an important contextual feature. Motifs reflect relationships and adaptations to rules in a market. What are their effect if you look at the outcomes of the people in the cliques compared to like a random selection of people who throughout the market? We find evidence that they're doing better. They figure out the trade-off and they cycle through it with their friends, and they do quite well. There's tremendous efficiencies here. Now, of course, there is evidence, and there's already evidence in the literature that maybe this is actually not a good thing. There's some evidence from Ann ten Brunsel and others, colleagues, find that sometimes when people find a friend that they want to make a transaction with, they're going to miss other opportunities in the market. So far, we're finding that the optimalities driven by the friendship cliques actually is what's going on here. But that's I think a really interesting question is, when is it when is it a good thing, when is it not a good thing? Because invariably, like almost everything, it's a mix. And so there you have it. So and I did it before time. Thank you very much. Any questions? And not only questions for me, but for all the other people in the symposium. And I guess what I'll do is I'll hand it over to Aya. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And I love how also this ties us back to our first 2 presentations about, friend or partner and self-effects and expectations. So I'll pretend that closes the circle and indeed invite all of you who've been fantastic chat participants to raise your hands and ask whoever you want, whatever you want. And thanks. Oh, I guess I'll call on people. Godfrey?
Hi, thank you all. I really appreciate this. Peter, if you don't mind me picking on you now. Have you considered, apart from friends, you might just have a good relationship with a real estate person over the years. I go back to deal with, I do some real estate business, and I always go back to the very first person that I interacted with. I don't think we consider each other friends, but you know, the experience is a good one, and therefore I go back to that person each time.
Hi, Godfrey. Nice to see you, or
Hi.
to see your name.
Yes.
I assume you're really there. But if you wanted to show yourself, there you are.
Yes, yes.
Great to see you. In fact, last time I saw you was in Dublin, I believe, and at the Guinness factory. And I've got a great picture of you standing next to one of those giant machines, Guinness machines.
Yes.
No, you're right. Great to see you. And great question about that touches on actually a lot of really important variables. For example, things like reputation, past experience, history, and that all come to bear in in the future. And so absolutely and we see some of that in some in looking at the patterns in this market. It clearly is a benefit in the paradigm that we have, that we've been working with, to make as many deals as possible, as fast as possible. And sometimes somebody will contact another person, they'll try to do a transaction, and it's a friend, and for some reason they can't get the deal done. And when we see that, when they can't get the deal done, they don't go back to that person. And so I think we're just consistent with, I think, with what you're saying.